Good afternoon, and welcome back to our next session of Defense One's Outlook 2022. I'm Jacqueline Felcher, a senior national security correspondent at Defense One. Thank you so much for joining us on this panel on women in defense in Congress. Before we begin this session, I have one quick housekeeping note for our audience. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the main stage chat function, which is where you can interact with your fellow attendees. Now to jump right into our panel. The defense world, both on and off Capitol Hill, has historically been dominated by men, but that's beginning to change. This year alone, 5 new women joined the House Armed Services Committee. A record number of women are serving in the current Congress, and some of this new wave of women are joining committees with oversight of the military. Today, I'm very lucky to be joined by a few of these women, both of whom are members of the House Armed Services Committee. We're joined by Representative Mickey Sherrill, a Democrat from New Jersey and Navy veteran who was elected to Congress in 2019, and Representative Stephanie Bice, a Republican from Oklahoma who's nearing the end of her first year in Congress. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us here today. To start off with, I'm wondering if each of you can talk a little bit about what drew you to want to be on the House Armed Services Committee. Representative Bice, we can start with you.
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me to participate with Representative Sherrill this morning. I think for me, I recognize the importance of the military to Oklahoma. We have 5 military installations, including one that is actually not in my congressional district, but is very close to it. And I have a significant number of the civilian and military families that work on the base. And so recognizing that we have this large military presence that is an important part of our communities really drew me to the fact that we needed somebody on House Armed Services to continue to fight for servicemen and women.
Representative Sherrill, what about you? You obviously have a background serving in the military. Was that a big part of your wanting to serve on the committee?
Well, it was that combined with, I also have a base on, in my district, it's one of the largest economic drivers in North Jersey, as well as a huge point of modernization for our armed forces, a critical base for research and development. So it was that combination. My background as a Navy helicopter pilot and years serving in our military, combined with the desire to really serve my district well and support our base and the men and women who serve there.
So it's clear just scrolling through the membership at the House Armed Services Committee that there's a transition afoot. When you start at the top, it's a lot of men, and as you get closer to the bottom, it's a lot of newer women members who have joined the committee. So what has your experience been serving during this transitional time? Representative Sherrill?
Well, you know, it does do that in large part, although I don't want to undermine some of the wonderful representation we've had from people like Jackie Spear, who's fought for years on some of the initiatives we're finally able to get passed. But I do think part of the reason we've been able to get sexual assault out of the chain of command, something that I've been fighting for since I was a midshipman, not just since I served in our regular forces, but since I was a midshipman at the Naval Academy, and to see that finally having, you know, we think a very good chance of passing into law in this year's National Defense Authorization Act, I think is because of the years that people like Rep. Spear have put into that effort and that fight. But the reason I think we've been able to get it across the finish line is because of the women who are serving now, who have a deep appreciation and understanding of what this has been looking like in our military for years. So I'll tell you, I think the genesis of getting this over the finish line started at last year's NDA, when we were simply trying to get a pilot project through to take it out of the chain of command in our service academies, where those numbers of sexual assault have been remarkably stubborn, really unchanged since I was at the academy. And many of us feel a personal connection to that, not just because of our background with the academies, but because we as members of Congress nominate people to go to those academies. So we feel a personal responsibility for their, of course, safety there. And to see those numbers, to hear the stories that just hadn't changed over the years, and then to hear that we were having trouble just getting a pilot test project through to try to address this change. And we were told sort of again, well, let's just, let's study it. Let's study the problem. And I sort of lost patience at that point, because I really could not imagine what more study we needed to do when everything we were doing had made remarkably little changes in the outcomes. And so I spoke about my time serving there. And then Elaine Luria, who's also a Naval Academy graduate, spoke about her time and her commitment to this and how her position had evolved. And I think that hearing that, I think, was very powerful in helping the committee to really realize we weren't doing enough at that time.
Well, great. And Representative Vice, to you, what has your experience been like serving as more women are joining the committee? And again, not to discount some of the work of the senior women who have been there, but as we see greater numbers of women come in, what has your experience serving on the committee been like?
I think that's really the key. You have more women that are serving in Congress. And what's really fantastic is you have women like Mikey who have served themselves in the military and have that understanding and perspective. Less than a dozen have that sort of military experience. And so having women with the, boots on the ground, if you will, know-how of how the military works and what changes need to be made are an incredible asset to the House Armed Services Committee. This is a sort of a transformational time for the GOP because, last Congress, we had 13 women serving and now we have 31. And so it's a huge shift in allowing for women to really have their voices heard. And you're seeing it on every committee, but certainly on armed services as well.
So despite the growing number of women on these committees, the big four, that is the leaders of the panels in the House and Senate, are all still men, and only 3 of the 14 subcommittee chairs in the House are women. So do you think there is a glass ceiling for these defense-focused women on Capitol Hill, or do you think this is just a change that will take more time? Representative Vice, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I've never thought that there's a ceiling. I served in the state legislature for 6 years. I ended up by the time I was elected to Congress, I was in leadership. I had a committee chairmanship. I had put 2 state questions on 2 back-to-back ballots. And when I was first elected in 2014, there were only 19 women serving in the Oklahoma state legislature. So no, I don't think it's because there's some sort of glass ceiling for women. I think women haven't had the opportunity to step up and be in those roles. We are just now sort of seeing numbers that are, what I would say sort of equitable, maybe in some ways, in numbers across Congress. And so it will take some time for women to, sort of ascend into those leadership roles. But you have a Speaker of the House that's a woman. You have the, on the Democrat side, you have the conference chair that's a woman on the Republican side. Women are doing great things in Congress. We're just getting started.
Representative Cheryl, do you agree with that?
Yeah, so I would, because I don't think the glass ceiling has necessarily been in Congress. The glass ceiling has been getting to Congress. So many of the ways that our election systems have been running, especially, I always tell the story. When I was running for Congress the first time, I had a couple good quarters and was really coalescing the party in my state around my candidacy. And one of the people from Washington said, "Oh, that's funny. Who says you can't run a woman in New Jersey, huh?" And that was sort of a known thing, like, oh, women just don't do well in politics in New Jersey. And so my sense is there weren't enough women in Congress to get to those leadership ranks. We didn't have a critical mass. And I think what Rep. Bice said was so important, because I remember we had a sea change of women coming into the caucus in the last Congress, but we would look across the aisle and even, friends of mine from the GOP would say, well, I'm going to bring my daughter over to talk to. There's nobody over here for her to talk to, that kind of thing. And so to now have that replicated across the aisle, I think is critically important. So I think we are going to see growth in some of those leadership positions as we see many of the women who are, really just creating, like I said, a critical mass in Congress now come to the fore.
So in recent years, Congress has debated several issues related to women in the military. You mentioned sexual assault reform, which of course impacts men as well, but overwhelmingly does impact women in the military, women in combat. But the top issue today in the NDAA that we're watching pass right now is whether or not women will have to register for the Selective Service for the draft. And I'm wondering how you're making your voices heard on these types of issues. Representative Sherrill, if you want to get us started.
So something that, I have really been invested in as I came into Congress was, forming coalitions, broad coalitions of people from all over my caucus, from across the aisle. And one of those areas that's been really important have been the veterans. So I'm a part of the Four Country Caucus, which is a bipartisan group of veterans. And this has really, I think, been something that we already have a lot of those ties and bonds, and we can build on those, especially in issues related to things like national security and veterans, and start with that kind of legislation so we can bring people together and get good stuff done for the country. A lot of us have some iteration of what I said during my campaign, which, when I flew missions in a helicopter, I never said, oh, this is a Democratic mission or this is a Republican mission. So those coalitions have been incredibly important. And I think, that's what we're looking to continue to build on. And national service, to me, is one of the ways that we bring this country together, that we unite this country behind our values. I would like to see some form of national service, whether it be in our military, in our National Health Service, in AmeriCorps, in Teach for America, and the Peace Corps, some sort of giving back to our country and really working with people from across our country. I think there are just all of these stovepipe pockets of people that have never worked with or gotten to know, socialized with someone who's not a lot like them. And alternatively, I went to a college where we had people from every state in the nation. I then served all over this country with people from all up and down the economic ladder with very different backgrounds. And then I served overseas and saw, how important our values were and why they were important. And I'd love to have that passed on to young people as they enter into, the world. So I think this is a way that we begin that process. And that's why I'm very supportive of it.
What about you, Representative Bice? What unique perspectives do you think that you bring to this debate?
Well, the amendment to have women register for the Selective Service was actually taken out of the NDAA when it was passed last night. So it is not, I think, something that we'll see at least this Congress, but it is, I think, a conversation to be had. Certainly, you see women now that are much more excited about serving in the military. They're actively seeking it. Several of the Academy nominations that I received in the last few weeks are from young women who are excited for the opportunity to serve. So I do think that we're seeing a shift there and a change. I have questions about the draft itself. Is that really necessary anymore? Back in Vietnam, when we were, really struggling to get folks to step up, that may have been a point of contention. But today, I'm not sure that that's really necessary. I don't necessarily disagree with Representative Sherrill, though, in her idea of service. We are serving in some sort of unique capacity, but I think that there is something to be said for serving your country in whatever capacity that you may be able to do that, and getting a real perspective of what it's like to be part of something bigger.
So now you've both brought up the nominations for the military academies, which I do want to talk about. At the same time that members are pushing for more gender balance at the military academies, lawmakers still overwhelmingly nominate young men, according to a study from CNAS a couple of years ago. So what can you do to help more women reach the service academies? Does your office consider someone's gender in making sure there's a balance? Just how is your office approaching that, Representative Bice?
Well, I think first and foremost, we need to get young women interested in the military academies. I would say it's been a shift in just the last 5 to 10 years of women thinking of themselves in those roles. Interestingly enough, because of COVID, I really haven't had the opportunity to participate in many congressional delegation trips. We haven't really had many until the last, few months. But the very first trip that I went on was to West Point, to the United States Military Academy. And what struck me was how many women were in leadership roles. I had dinner the first evening with what I learned, the firsties, which are, I guess, the seniors in my world. And the head of the firsties was a female. You had the head of the student body was a female. So I think what's happening, and it's somewhat similar to what's happened in Congress, is you begin to see women in those roles and recognize that they have the opportunity to serve as well and to be part of a service academy. So educating these young women on the opportunity, I think, is first and foremost, and getting them excited to apply. The second piece of that is outreach. When in my district, we are doing academy days where we are inviting the high school students across the district. This has been virtual this year, but to come in and really hear from our military men and women about their service in the particular academies, ask questions, understand the process. And it's starting early. You know, we're starting 8th and 9th grade to really, plant that seed early, give them the tools and resources they need, make sure they understand the requirements that are going to be necessary, and then support them as they apply through the process.
Representative Cheryl, would love to get you to weigh in here as well, especially as an Academy grad, in terms of how you think Congress should approach and how you approach your nominations, and how you take gender into that account.
Yeah, so that's a great question. We look at all aspects of the population that's applying to our service academies. And I think what we're very aware of is we had some schools in our district that seemed to have an academy track. So we always had a great group of people applying from certain schools in the district. And that just made us realize that we needed to do more outreach to the other schools. So we have certainly gone out to all of our guidance counselors to make sure they understand these opportunities. Service academies are somewhat unique. The application process is complex, shall we say. I remember going through it myself. It's very difficult to manage. And so, making sure everyone understands how to do it. The guidance counselors are comfortable with that. And then we saw actually a concerning downtick in some of the applications from women in our district during COVID. And I think part of that was the normal pathways that some of our young women would take to do a week at the academy or do a sports camp at the Naval Academy. And again, envision themselves in that role in a way that was a little bit different from a sort of typical path, had been closed because of COVID. So we've re-engaged on some of the other ways that we can make sure that women throughout the district see this as an opportunity like the young men do. And certainly we've sort of canvassed all this to determine who's doing the best job across the country, how we can do better. And there are districts who've cracked the code. In fact, one of the women I've graduated with was telling me that she didn't know if her daughter, she was out in California, she didn't know if her daughter was going to be able to get a nomination because 3 other women from her daughter's high school were trying to get into the Naval Academy. So obviously, this is something that's appealing to a broad swath of people. I would also mention we're very cognizant of the fact that some of our communities are kind of more well-versed in entering into our military than others. So we're looking at some of our new immigrant communities who maybe didn't see that as a pathway to make sure that they're aware of what the academies are and how people can serve their country. So I have been proud of the outreach we've done. But again, if you look at the numbers at our service academies, my class was just under 10%. We're still now at only a quarter of the class. So there's still work to be done there.
So we've talked about the importance of increasing diversity at the academies, but also the importance of increasing diversity on the House Armed Services Committee and in Congress specifically. I'm wondering, do you think a more diverse voice is needed on the House Armed Services Committee, and sort of how you overcome that barrier, whether that's, to women joining the Armed Services Committees or just to getting, if the step is getting more women elected to Congress, sort of how do you get a more gender diverse perspective on the committee? Representative Bice, you want to start with you?
Well, I think the first thing I learned after I was elected to the state legislature is that women oftentimes have to be asked to run. We do not envision ourselves in these roles. We don't aspire to be members of Congress. Someone sort of taps us on the shoulder and says, hey, you should do this. And so maybe changing that mindset a bit to sort of make sure that women recognize their abilities. You know, I've said many times over that women are no better at this job than our male counterparts. We just come with a very different perspective. And having that perspective lends itself to looking at things in a different way, you know, and a great example of that is some of the work that's being done in House Armed Services on parental leave. I have a bill that is looking at expanding parental leave to moms and dads. When you enter the military, you really, oftentimes are young and you don't think about those sort of, family decisions as you get down the road. And so making sure that we're preparing our servicemen and women for the ability to be parents and be great parents, given the fact that oftentimes they're going to be deployed somewhere for months at a time, give them the opportunity to be with that, newborn or that newly adopted child and create those bonds, I think is one of the ways that we as members can maybe shift the mindset a little bit, make sure that we're focusing on the family as well as, military readiness and national security preparedness for the 21st century.
Representative Cheryl, what about you on ways to get more women kind of in the room where some of these decisions are made for the armed services?
Well, certainly, I think we've seen some interesting trends in armed services. When I left the military over a decade ago, I would never have foreseen that I would then kind of re-engage in defense and see many of the CEOs of our major defense corporations were women. It's fantastic. I think many of the groups of people in defense, that women have some of the support groups, which I think it's always great to just support one another as you kind of go through figuring out how am I going to maintain my career while at the same time having children. And then it's on us. It's on people like Rep. Bice and myself to make sure that we help ease the pathway, as I like to think about it. And that's why these voices, when you're saying, how do we get more diverse voices in armed services, I think part of the question that has to be answered is, and why do we want that? And Rep. Bice laid that out really nicely. And that's what, we're saying all the time. It's a cliche now, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu kind of thing for women, and why they need to run and, why you need to get in there. But I can't tell you how many times legislation has come up just since I've been in Congress that was aimed at fixing a problem for families, working parents in the workforce. And oftentimes the burden falls on working moms. And I looked at that legislation and I said, well, that wouldn't have helped me. Right? That wouldn't have made a difference in my ability to keep working. And believe me, I'm a mom of 4 kids. It's been a struggle. So making sure that as we're seeing this legislation, we can take our personal experiences and just tweak it. Just say, this is a great idea, but how it's going to really make an impact on working women is if you do it this way. That's the reason I think these voices count, and understanding what it's going to take to help support our military women. I recently had a bill just so we had bulletproof vests and gear that fit women. And I can tell you, part of the reason that was so important to me is because I could not fly over water when the temperature went below a certain degrees one winter, because the seals on my dry suit, and you could only fly with a dry suit when the water was too cold over water, were too loose. So I couldn't, the seals just did not fit my wrist. And they had to special order them, and it took months. And so one winter, I could only do overland flights. And let me remind you, I was flying in the Navy, so that was not really super helpful. So these are the kind of experiences that we bring to the table to just make sure that when people think, oh, I'm sure if they just tighten the Velcro, it's going to be fine. We say, no, that's not actually the case. We need to make sure that this gear fits our women forces. So those are the kind of conversations we have.
That's super interesting. So looking ahead, I'd love to get from both of you sort of what are some of your top priorities for national security in the new year? If there are, topics you'd like to see hearings about or legislation you're planning to introduce. It seems like this NDAA is nearing the finish line. So, what's next for both of you in terms of top priorities? Representative Cheryl, would you like to start?
Well, as you can imagine, Picatinny Arsenal is always my top priority, and not only because of the importance to my district, but because they really are just such a key part of research and development for the modernization of our armed forces as we move into this new modern era. Another thing that I'm really interested in is new propellants. As we're going to be forward deployed in places that, quite frankly, we don't have a lot of support bases, how are we going to propel much of our gear? Carrying diesel fuel, for example, is incredibly heavy. How are we going to move into new areas to make sure that we're on the cutting edge of what we need to do while at the same time being great stewards of our economy? These are conversations. Many people don't know that we've had a lot of test and demonstration projects on some of our bases and some of these new areas that have gone incredibly well, to the point where some of our bases are now helping supply power outside of the base. They have done so well in some of these new demonstration projects. And then some of this goes to like battery storage capability, which of course, as a state with the largest investment in offshore wind, I know Rep. Bice could compete on wind, but offshore wind, we're really interested in this battery storage capability, and we're testing out some of this on some of our military bases as we can move forward to support the base and to support our troops and then to support the nation. So these are some areas I'd really like to explore in the upcoming NDAA.
Representative
I think for me, sure. I think for me, I'm just finishing up my first year in Congress. And so I often like to spend time just learning. I need to learn the process. I need to understand. Having not served in the military, I'm a little bit at a disadvantage. So I want to spend more time just understanding where the needs are. One area that I think I could be really helpful in is the new city subcommittee, which is cyber information security, information technology. This area is something that I think Congress hasn't focused on in the past, and having a tech background, I feel like I'm well positioned to be able to really dive in and become a subject matter expert in that area and be helpful when we're looking at the future and being prepared, national security preparedness. This is an area that I think oftentimes gets overlooked. We think through shipbuilding and, munition supplies and things like that, but we don't really think about the impact that cyber can have on all of those things. And so I hope to be really a resource and a subject matter, expert in that cyber area as we move forward.
Delving a little bit deeper into some of your specific priorities, Representative Cheryl, you've been a supporter of Defense Department operating more sustainably. You talked about that a little bit with the alternative fuel sources and doing more to address climate change. So I'm wondering your reaction to the recent reports that the Pentagon has put out. They've put out a lot of paperwork recently on combating climate change, sort of if you think that's a good first step, or if you'd like to see the Pentagon doing more in that arena.
So what I think we've seen some really good work done towards is making our military more resilient. So how do we make sure, we have unfortunately, some airfields that face flooding challenges, where, for example, so we're facing climate issues across the world at our many military bases. And I think what the military has done an incredibly good job with is determining where the problems are and how we're going to make it resilient. How are we going to continue operations if we see rising sea levels? And looking at the security aspects of that, where are the destabilization problems across the world as we face growing climate change? That said, I think what I'd like to see more of is not simply understanding how we mitigate the impact of climate change, but actually mitigate our effect on the climate. Picatinny Arsenal is kind of the center of the military in my district. There's a Superfund site on Picatinny Arsenal. We really have faced across the country degradation. In fact, Rep. Bice and I chair the Environment Subcommittee on Science, Space, and Technology. She's the ranking member, and we just held a hearing on PFAS. Much of that impacts, we both noted, and as did other members on that on that subcommittee hearing, that it's inordinately really impacted military members. With AFFF foam, for example, that's been used widely throughout the military. So these are things that I think I'd like to see the military doing more of, not just mitigating the impact, but actually mitigating what the military does to create some of the climate issues and to remediate some of those.
So Representative Bice, switching gears a little bit to one of your priorities in this NDAA, one of the amendments you proposed that was accepted would aim to reduce the stigma around the mental health for troops and veterans. I'm wondering why that was a top priority for you in your first year in the Congress.
We see and recognize that our military servicemen and women face some real challenges, particularly when they come home from deployment, and making sure that they have resources available to them to deal with mental health challenges that they may be facing, I think is incredibly important. And they deserve that type of care. And so for me, seeing it in my community, we have a large veteran homeless population. Oftentimes those individuals are battling some mental health issues. So making sure that they have access to resources, I think for my community especially, was really important. And I was thrilled that my colleague from California, Pete Aguilar, has also been looking at this very issue and was really excited to be part of putting this amendment together.
So you two have actually introduced legislation together this year that would allow National Guard members who are disabled while serving on state active duty to get medical care through the VA. Can you talk a little bit about the process of working together on that, sort of how the idea started and what's the status of that?
I'll sort of start with that.
Yeah.
So it actually started with a situation that happened in my home state. There was a gentleman that was National Guard in Oklahoma. He was helping during the February ice storm in Oklahoma, which was incredibly devastating, shut down the state virtually. And while he was out on duty, he ended up being hit by a out of control truck and severely injured. And unfortunately, because he was on state active duty and National Guard, he really didn't have access to any medical resources. His pathway was apply for workers' comp. And that's the only opportunity you have. And what was interesting is that a few days later, he was called up on federal active duty. So, or that unit was. So we have to figure out, how can we make sure that these individuals are being supported in these roles? Because in this situation, the gentleman that was impacted, he actually was law enforcement and can no longer work. So not only has he been impacted because of the accident and not having health insurance that, or the ability to seek that care, but then now he's not able to work in the field that he was prior. So it's been a real, I think, double whammy for him. Just making sure that we're taking care of National Guard, I think, is also a big thing for my state.
Representative Cheryl, do you have anything to add there?
I would just say it was great because Rep. Bice came to me to tell me about this piece of legislation, which made so much sense because, as you can imagine, in New Jersey, we had some of the first really critical outbreaks of COVID. In our state, we were the epicenter of several outbreaks over 2019 and early 2020. And so it was, we widely used our National Guard to address that. And so this piece of legislation seemed to be just an extra measure we could take care of those people who've, quite frankly, taken care of all of us for the past couple of years, especially.
So the Armed Services Committees are consistently touted as a place of bipartisanship. I think, this is obvious. You guys are working together on this bill, though you clearly disagree on a number of other issues. As Washington becomes even more divided, how do you maintain that bipartisanship on the Armed Services Committee? And do you have any thoughts on how to sort of give some of that bipartisanship outside of the committee to other parts of the government? Representative Cheryl, would you like to start?
Sure. So this is something that is, I care deeply about, and it's something my district cares deeply about. I think when people in this country see Democrats and Republicans coming together on legislation, they get a sense that, oh, if both sides can agree on this, this must be a good piece of legislation. Both of, they must really be putting the country first and not their own partisan interests first. So it's a little bit of a kind of a seal of good housekeeping on some of our legislation in my district, how people kind of look at that. And so it's important. And we always start our legislative process in my office by kind of thinking through who might be interested in doing this with us across the aisle. And we often get great feedback, because not only do we want to pass legislation that we think is good, but we also want to pass legislation that is good to people across the country, that really makes a difference in their lives. And a lot of times when we reach out to work with people with different viewpoints, they kind of add something to it, or say, actually, if we kind of frame it this way, I think more people would be helped, or more people would understand what we're trying to do. So that's really important. And it's why I've loved serving on the House Armed Services Committee. We generally pass a very bipartisan piece of legislation out of committee. We all come together, and it is the sort of democracy and the legislative process at work. For example, the chair of the committee did not agree to some of the spending on the committee, but was willing to work with the ranking member, who felt very, very strongly about that, and felt that that was the only way that we were going to get this through committee, and work with him on what that spending might then go to that made sense, even though he didn't support it. He didn't, we didn't decide, okay, well, we're just going to then pass a partisan bill out of committee. We decided, okay, we've got to negotiate and work here and see, what makes sense. I actually supported it because of, as Rep. Ice was talking about cyber, I really like some of the cyber initiatives in that. So this was how we work. I think there's very few committees where if the Democrats are in the majority and there's a Republican agenda that the ranking member has that the chair of the committee is not in favor of, I think there are very few committees that would come to an agreement like that and get such wide support. So I really value that, because to me, this is a legislative body. We're all, at the end of the day, I keep telling people this isn't a zero-sum game. It's if it's not, oh, if Republicans lose, I win. We're all Americans. We need the country to win on this one. And so that's why I really love serving there. And that's what I think so far we've been able to continue to do. So I'm knocking on wood, because I think it's really important.
Well, and I would just, I think Representative Cheryl said it so well. This committee, it seems very collegial and bipartisan, and we do work together. We work on legislation. We give ideas. As a freshman member during the markup of the NDAA, I presented an amendment that I really didn't have much hopes it would actually pass, and it did. So I was pretty excited and also shocked a bit that I was able to get that through. I think for members, the other thing that I would tell folks that are watching is that you often hear about the bickering and the back and forth, but you don't often hear about the good things happening. And I think the NDAA is a great example of the bipartisan good things that can happen when you bring down the rhetoric, you bring down the tenor, and you really try to work together. You can get really good things done for the country.
Out of time for today. Thank you to both of you for joining us. I think this has been such an interesting conversation, and I really appreciate both of you being here. To our audience, please stay tuned for the final session of the 9th Annual Defense One Summit Outlook 2022. For Defense One, I'm Jacqueline Felcher.